Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show with another interesting episode today. You're going to love this. First off, I always have a great time co-hosting with Sandra Ponce de Leon. She is the co-producer also on this episode, and she brings us Robert Jacobson, who's written a book called Space is Open for Business. Now look, a lot of people laugh at the Space Force concept. President Trump brought it together, and they're like, haha, giggle, giggle. The thing is, and a lot of you know from listening to Megan from Mars, that episode from Meghan Kane, and by the way, look in the show notes for Meghan Kane's episodes, space is open for business. People are really doing this. There's companies looking at investing. There's already companies up and doing it. There are people provisioning space companies. So think about this. There is a lawyer for space. There is a broker for space, for things going to space. There are people that handle multinational legal issues, international space issues, all kinds of things. There's companies working on how do we get to asteroids and bring back some of those rare metals that are hard to get here and stop damaging the earth. And then there's also people like, hey, we have to also protect the environment out in space. We can't just go out and start knocking all these rocks around and smash them into bits and bring them back to pieces, because we actually have to preserve some of the natural beauty of space. And so there's advocates for the, I guess you would call it the environment of space. All of these things exist. And so it's guys like Robert Jacobson that are helping us to understand just what this is going to look like as we become a species that can move around the solar system, at least robotically, if not with also human power. Anyhow, I know you're going to love it because it's just fascinating. There's a zillion questions and you have to read the book. It's so interesting. Like if you think Space Force is a joke, if you think, space is just space, read the book and you're just going to be amazed at all of the advancement that's happened even in the last 20 years. I mean, it is truly, truly, truly incredible. So Robert Jacobson. Hey, real quick, the Save the Brave rifle raffle is still going on. Go to blackstonearms.com and buy a raffle ticket, $100 a piece. The rifle is a $5,000 value rifle. You can do it, you can buy it, or you can just donate. Go to savethebrave.org, click on the donate tab, put a small amount of money in each month, or you can donate a one-time donation. The other day, someone donated a boat. No fooling. You can donate land, you can donate stock shares, whatever you've got. You're looking around thinking, hey, you know what I've got here? I've got this old boat. Maybe these guys can use it. Okay, great. I've got something. Hey, maybe we can use it. Okay, great. Let's do it. Let's figure out how to do that. Okay, enough about all that stuff. Thank you all so much for your support. Continue to click on the subscribe button. I can't tell you how much that helps. I see the numbers going up, so thank all of you who do that. There are so many people from India now listening to the show. What up, India? We love you guys. All right, here we go. Here comes Robert Jacobson.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pauline Shanks Kaurin, and you are watching the Break It Down show. I am here today reflecting my own views and not the views of the US Naval War College or the Department of Navy.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, this is fun. We actually tried to do this a while back, but between schedules and everything else and a worldwide pandemic and panic, we are only just now getting to this. But we are lucky to have Pauline on, and there's other people in the field that work on the study of ethics and military and how those things collide. And it's real easy to just dismiss this topic like, oh, this is simple. You just do ethical things. But you and I both know it's not even close to that simple. And how do you train? And this is my actual question. How do you train, Pauline? How do you train service members to be, I'm going to use quoted fingers, ethical?
In true philosophical form, I'm going to object to the premise of the question.
Love it.
Because I don't think I'm in the training business. I think I'm in the education business, because I don't think you can train people to be ethical or unethical. I think you can educate them. I think you can give them practice. I'm a follower of both Aristotle and Hume, and Hume especially thought habit was really important. So I think practice is really important. So I can educate people about what ethics is, how it's different than morality, what kind of moral issues they're going to encounter in military ethics, in military operations. I can help them engage in ethical reflection and analysis and being able to justify and articulate, and this is really important, one of the differences between morality and ethics, an ethical person can articulate the reasons why they're doing what they're doing to someone else. So we can have education on all of that, and we can practice, and we do lots of case studies and scenarios and sort of mini exercises, and we can read about what other people have experienced, because I would argue that most of the issues that people face in war are not new. They're different mutations on things. So the question of distance has been with us for quite some time, whether it's remote warfare or, the Battle of Agincourt or, trench warfare. So a lot of these questions have existed. So you can read other people's memoirs, engage in art, watch movies, all those kinds of things to try to develop your moral imagination. So we can kind of give them a toolkit and we can practice, but at the end of the day, it's, most philosophers, I think, believe it's up to each individual and each community that they are a part of. And in my book, I talk about that it's both of these. It's not just the individual, it's also the community of practice that is the military. So you sort of load people, it's sort of like your children. You load them up and you send them out and you hope for the best. And you do lots of, after action hot washes, when things happen, to try to talk it through and hope they learn something from it. And then over time, one hopes that, people get better at it.
Yeah, I can just see myself in a post-combat, debrief, and, the patrol has gone fairly smoothly with some, questionable things, and have a guy, with a dip going, "You need to be more ethical, brother."
I don't even know what that means.
Exactly. Me neither. All right. So one of the other things I wanted to lay down in terms of groundwork is, as service members, we tend to, and I'm going to be completely unfair when I say this, but we tend to focus on stoicism. I submit, as someone who's done a lot of combat time, that that isn't good enough, because focusing on yourself and seeking to not offend or be offended and all those kind of traditional stoic values doesn't work when you're attempting to, through modern conflict, bring stability to a foreign land, to build up the internal government, police force, military, all these things that we do in modern conflict. I don't think being stoic is the right solution to that problem. There's elements of stoicism in this, but I don't think that you can act that way, because we are so much a part of an active change agent in these environments, and that changes how we approach our ethics, I think.
Even though I hold the Stockdale Chair in professional military ethics, I have a fair amount of skepticism about some versions. First of all, Stoicism is both a Greek and Roman traditions that span, depending on how you count, 400 or 500 years. So it's not just one person. We tend to focus, especially Stockdale, we tend to focus on Epictetus, but there are lots of other Stoics. So I think Stoicism can be broadly helpful, but one of my issues with Stoicism is does not engage the emotions in a way that I think are necessary to be effective, particularly in combat, conventional or unconventional or whatever term you want to use. So I think Stoicism can be helpful, but it is largely understood as an individual sort of self-oriented philosophy. And, David Hume, who I wrote my dissertation on, who's a Scottish philosopher, was influenced by the Stoics, but he also argued that we had to have we couldn't just think about ourselves. We had to think about the community that we are a part of, moral obligations to other people, sentiment, all of these kinds of things. So I think Stoicism can be helpful, but I think it can also be harmful. I think in some ways, Stoicism may be contributing to things like moral injury, because it sets up expectations that you should be able to handle all this and it's no big deal and you just have to order your thoughts correctly and everything will be fine. And if you go back to James Stockdale and his time in internment as a POW, and you look at what he says about that, it is clear that he did rely on Stoicism in many ways. But he also, I would argue, engaged in what's called care ethics, and also wrestled with existentialism. He attempts to commit suicide, which is sort of Camus says that's the ultimate philosophical question of, should I live or should I die? So I think the Stockdale legacy is one of not tactical leadership, but strategic leadership, and therefore is much broader than simply stoicism. Because it was just about stoicism, he would have effectively, like he was in command, but he welcomed people back into the fold after they had broken under torture. He engaged in an ethic of care, both for himself, for other people, as well as for his captors.
Yeah.
Like his captors, he was able to develop rapport and relationships with them in certain kinds of ways that we might find surprising, unless you read the works of Nelson Mandela, who essentially does the same thing. So I think it's much more complicated. So I worry about the military's narrow focus, not just on stoicism, but on a very particular kind of stoicism that is very popular right now. And some of the versions of it that are popular right now are really nothing more than self-help schlock. Sorry. It's just true. It's so overly simplified that as a philosopher looking at this, I'm like, mm-mm. And we have the Stockdale Leaders course at the Navy War College. And so we spend time talking about this, and, we all love Stockdale. Like I'm thrilled to have a chair that bears his name, but I also think he would be the first person to say, this is more complicated.
It is. And I would say that, from my own personal experience, there's a level below tactics, the ground truth level, where things get really crazy because it doesn't make sense even 2 echelons above, like at the platoon level. The reality that you experience when you're on a patrol in a given area is dramatically different than what happens at brigade or battalion or even company, because they're oftentimes not co-located. And to assign a basic set of ethical values to get things right, it doesn't work. You can't reliably make that happen. And let me give you a concept that I've kind of come up with is we have these patrols that go out with these packets of help. You've got farm help, you've got, whatever, like small business help, all these different aid elements, female engagement, and they all go out. But you reach a point well before all of these elements are put together of what I would call ethical saturation, where you putting so many good things in the bucket, there's no more room for it. And so you end up with these negative outcomes. Like you go out and you engage women without, part of the thing in our paper is like you seek to improve the condition of women without knowing the condition of the women, and replace women with farmers, business owners, governmental, anybody. So that care, like the do no harm part, we're completely absent from that because we're really focused internally on what does my boss want? The commander says we have to do this. And part of what I would do is I would say, hold on, as soon as you say that, I know we're in the wrong spot. Our mindset is wrong. It's not about your boss. It's about what's possible here. And the boss is actually the governor, not your commander who's 500 miles away.
Yeah. So in my book on obedience, I talk about professional judgment and discretion, which is a version of Aristotle's virtue prudence.
Okay.
And that is the form of thought he thought was necessary to be virtuous. It's not wisdom. It's not anything else. It's prudence. I think while we can have conversations about categorical imperative or utilitarianism or virtue ethics or care ethics, and those are all really helpful rehearsals, help you think through problems in advance, context really matters. So what we need are people who can exercise that judgment and discretion in the field, adjusting to what the context is, what the reality is, understanding things like culture, gender, race. I mean, we're in a national moment right now where it's really clear that many people don't understand those basic things, much less try to integrate that with any kind of, ethical framework that they have. And context does matter, which is not to say everything's relative, but you do have to, especially in care ethics, I have to parent my 2 teenage boys differently because they are different human beings and they need different things. And the idea that I could somehow just have one set of parenting rules and it's going to work across time, space, the same as that when they were toddlers, it'll still work now that they're teenagers. I mean, that's kind of crazy when you think about that, right? And so it's not that everything's relative, but, it is that you have to be able to make ethical judgments, justify what you're doing, think through what you're doing, be able to deliberate, engage in reflection, both before, during, and after, because whatever you assess afterwards is what's going to feed into your next engagement or your next action. So it's quite complicated, which is why I don't think you can train for it. Because training, that tends to be skill focused. Being ethical is not a skill.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to create an ethical conundrum that nobody's talked about or trained about. You'll get criticized for it, but we can talk specifically about things that have happened on combat patrols. But you look at the ethical dilemmas that a commander has. You've got this responsibility to teach and train and prepare and harden your force for battle, whatever level you're at. That's a completely different focus than, teach, train, enable a local element of the government, police, or whatever. And it's even further than, create stability and counter the insurgency. Like what ultimately happens is we are the counterinsurgency because we are washing away what the normal is. We talk about rule of law all the time, and you read rule of law and you understand we're encountering a rule of law and seeking to corrupt it and change it to something that we perceive to be better. That already is an ethical problem. Like you guys handle murder here. You don't have a penal system. You have a civil system. Okay, let's change all that with no tax base. That's not ethical. Or it's a challenge at least.
Or it runs into ethical difficulties. Yeah, I guess the other thing to think about is I think that sometimes people think of ethics as a discipline as something that you get that at the academies, you get that when you go through ROTC or OCS or what have you, and then you might get them again when you go to the war colleges. But ethics is something that should be happening at every level, every single day. It should not just be the commander who engages in it. Anyone who has any leadership responsibility, all the way down to the very lowest person who's in charge of someone else, should be constantly engaging in what I think of as ethics education, right? So I think we think of it as we will now sit here and have our ethics brief. That is not ethics education. Ethics is education is what you do with your kid in the car on the way home from soccer practice, and they lost and they're pissed off, and you say, okay, what happened? And you talk through it and you help them make meaning out of it, because ethics is basically making meaning. Yeah. And they figure out maybe what went wrong, what they could have done better, and then what they're going to do for the future. And that has to be happening. That's not someone, I think people always tell me, well, ethics is not my job. And I look at them and say, actually it is. It is every single person's job. And so I think if we reframe how we're thinking about ethics, then when we go into these more, say, complicated or even complex environments like you're talking about, then it's not, I have to follow this rule, which doesn't seem to make any sense given, let's say, Iraqi culture, right? There's something that's a disconnect here. But if I don't have any prudence, if I don't have professional judgment and discretion, I can't sort through it. Because if all I've got is the rule, or all I have is the core values card, and then I'm trying to sort through what to do based on one of the core values, then you're going to have trouble. Yeah. And we do have trouble. But I think it's in part because we have to, it has to go much further down. And this is something that you need a lot of practice at.
Boy, yes. I was just about to ask you, and you're right. We need a lot of practice at this. Again, from my experience, ethics are not just situational, but they can be moment by moment. You can literally shoot someone in a firefight and then immediately go render aid for that person and switch from, these two completely different worlds that make no sense to us, and even less sense to the person that you just shot, that you're coming up there. Like, they have no idea how to deal with that. And that really, when you go into a room, you clear a house or a building and everything is lethal until someone calls the all clear. And that means, like, the ethics are completely different. And then once that all clear is sounded, a completely different level of care and handling of that situation changes. And then all of that can be interrupted by the chaos of combat again, where, like, let's say someone who we thought was dead isn't dead. And, now they become a problem. It's like, these are really challenging things that I don't know how you practice for them. I don't know how you practice for encountering a man who's engaged in an illicit activity with a young boy and keep your patrol alive when there's no help coming. You can't just kill everybody, but this is also a heinous thing that we're supposed to deal with. And then we also have a mission to conduct the very next day in the same village. These are exceptionally challenging things that how do you practice for that?
Well, I mean, I think the Stoics did have this idea of rehearsal. So you try to rehearse, because the Stoics were big on, you are like an actor, you're playing a role, you inhabit a role. Okay. So when you are clearing the house, you're in combat role, right? When it's all clear or someone surrendered to you, or someone needs aid, then you're switching to a different role, and you can switch back. You may have to switch back in a matter of seconds. And I think as much as possible, you try to rehearse, you try to talk through, you watch movies, and even though they're fictional depictions, like there isn't a lot, there's not a lot that's new. A lot of this is actually fairly predictable, but I think the thing that the students I've had that have been successful have been students who are comfortable with ambiguity and who can switch back and forth pretty quickly. Yeah. And if you think about when you're a parent, especially if you're a working parent, especially right now, right? You're at home, you're trying to work, you got the cat running across the screen while you're trying to do an interview, you got the dog who wants outside, and then the kid comes up, but I'm still supposed to be talking about military ethics. So there's just a lot of switching back and forth that has to happen. And I think that being able to deal with complexity, not just complicated things, but complexity where it's not clear what the right answer is, where there may be multiple right answers, where it's not even clear what the problem is. There's a lot of mental and ethical and empathetic skills that you need to be effective in that domain. And so that requires being able to engage complexity. And you have to sort of train people initially to get them all on the same page. But once you've got that, then it's time to start making things complicated and complex and getting them to engage, to practice in small ways. Like and I mentioned this in the book, like I'm not handing my 13-year-old the keys to my truck and saying, good luck with that.
See you later.
Be home by 5, right? No, of course not. Like I'm going to give him driving lessons. He's going to take driving lessons in school. There's going to be lots of conversations, lots of practice, probably some bumpy rides, right? Maybe an accident or two. And then over time, he's going to develop certain skills, especially judgment, but also just practice and more at home in the environment of driving, which isn't one that he right now is used to, except on a video screen. This is an iterative experience, right? I think people think, and this happens sometimes when I get students at the Naval War College, they tell me, well, I am a leader and I am fully ethical, so I don't need your leadership and profession of arms class because I'm good to go. And I smile and I look at them and I say, no, you're not.
Yeah.
Because we're never good to go. If you're good to go, you're dead.
You're bad.
Right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
This is not a thing that has a beginning, a middle, and we're done now.
Yeah.
There's no we're done now, except with a body bag, right? Then you're done, I guess.
Well, that's the other thing too. Like when you might be making the right ethical choice, and it may cost you or someone that you are working with, it may cost their life, and now you've got a whole different problem. I mean, it's one thing to be ethical, but you still have to be tactically proficient in the area that you're in, an area that doesn't tolerate a bunch of messing around. It's dangerous work, and to try to be this pious, ethical person.
Here's the thing, though. I think Americans in particular equate being ethical or really being moral.
Okay.
Being moral is, making a claim about what's right and wrong. We tend, because of our Puritan heritage, to view being moral as being morally pure. And that is a deeply flawed and problematic notion of what it means to be a moral or virtuous person. Moral person is a person who consistently and regularly does the right thing for the right reason and the right way and the right context and so on, from Aristotle. But they're also someone who can learn from their mistakes and constantly is growing and changing. A moral person is not someone who never does anything wrong.
Right.
And so we really need to, especially in the military, sort of have a zero tolerance sort of focus here. And it's really dangerous. And it leads to things like moral injury and having these expectations that you're going to come home with all of your people intact from a combat situation. Now, some people I know have been lucky enough and able to do that. That's not a reasonable expectation. Like, people die and get hurt in combat. That's like rule number 1.
Yeah.
Right? From MASH. And rule number 2 is doctors can't change rule number 1, right?
Yes.
So in all things, consult MASH as your guiding philosophy.
Yeah, the cost of that, and again, that goes back to like the commander's ethos, and how do you prepare for that inevitability that people die in combat, and what is ethical, and you look at like just the different planes of responsibility that you have there. If you're a reserve commander and everybody in your command has a real job that's comes before soldiering, and what you owe those families to these young, it becomes a lot to deal with. And you're right. It's not about pious and being ethical are definitely different things. Why don't you give us another way to look at being ethical so we have a platform to work off of as we continue the conversation?
So I think of being ethical or being moral, really, but also ethical. Ethical is the ability to not just do the right thing, but know why you did it and know what the reason was and justify and articulate it to other people. Many children and teenagers are moral, but not ethical. They can do the right thing, but often it's from accident or some other kind of motive.
Mm-hmm.
So another way to think about being moral is the way Aristotle thinks about it in terms of excellence. So it means to be excellent at being a human being. That doesn't mean it's without flaw. It also means you're constantly striving for better. But for Aristotle and Hume and some of the other people I talk about in my book, it's also not just about you. It's about the community that you are embedded in. So in the military, we have this sense of what it means to be an excellent soldier, sailor, airman, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
That's called the profession, right? And it's a community of practice, and it's evolving and it changes over time, but it has norms and expertise and values that help articulate what excellent looks like. So excellent is not something I get to define for myself. It is something that's defined by the community of which I'm a part, whether that's the military or the Navy or my family or, being a citizen of Rhode Island or whatever it is, right? So if we think about morality more as excellence, then it's something, if we think about like athletic excellence, like Tom Brady, not my favorite football star because I'm a Seahawks fan, right? But he's excellent. And we can look at him and Russell Wilson and say, here's why he's excellent. Does that mean he never fumbles the football or misses a catch or does things that are not good from a football point of view? Well, no. It means more times than not, he's on and he makes mistakes. He learns from them. But we're not perfect. He's not perfect. He's not pure. Sorry, Patriots and
Sanctified.
not.
Yes.
Right. He's not sanctified, but we can look at him and it's a collective decision. Even though I don't like him as a football player, still sore about the Super Bowl a few years back, I can look at him and say, yeah, he's an excellent player. And I think we do that with morality too. We look around and we say, yeah, that person's a moral person. We might find them completely and utterly annoying and not want to live our lives the way that they do, but we can look at them and say, yes, this is a person who's an example of moral excellence. So I think something like moral excellence, especially if you take the analogy to sports, is much more helpful because it allows growth. There are judgments that have to be made. There's education that has to happen. And football is not a one dude sport. Right? Or one gal sport, right? It's a team, right? And there's also the conventions of what football is. So one of the debates I find fascinating as a philosopher is the definition of what counts as a catch in the NFL, right? This is an argument people are having. Well, that was a catch. No, it wasn't a catch. But that's exactly what happens in a community of practice is people have standards, they have rules, but those rules may change over time, right? And as the community evolves or new needs come into view, right? At one point, women were not part of the military community practice. Neither were persons of color. Neither were persons of minoritized sexual identity. Those things have changed or in the process of changing, right? So a profession is not Samuel Huntington said this, and therefore we can never change anything we ever do, right? I'm sorry to break it to some of my colleagues out there, but
and I thought we should spend a moment and just make clear that when we're talking about the ethics and the examples that I'm using, it's because the modern version of combat is very complex, and I like to call it conflict. And a lot of times I refer to the enemy and I'm using quoted fingers, enemy, as the co-belligerent. Because a lot of times we're not fighting over a flag or a piece of land. We're fighting over people and in different ways. And again, this is from my experience, but I've got quite a bit of it. So when you look at trying to compete for these things ethically, it's hard. And so I think about a camp that I used to live on, and it had a switchback concertina wire security gate, and with 7 switchbacks. And if you didn't go deliberately through that concertina maze, you would snag every time. If you went deliberately through, you still would snag because it's just wide enough for a person. And I think in terms of operating ethically in these kind of complex environments, we want to do things and look, I'll just be honest, we don't care, or at least we don't act like we care about culture at all in the military. And that's just, based upon all of the evidence of everybody I've seen. We have a card for cultural things, and it's like, don't make this symbol, don't do, whatever. And those have nothing to do with the complexities of combat. So as we try to navigate through this concertina maze, we're still going to get snagged even when we go slow. It really, ethics and culture, they don't abide our schedule and our operation plan. But again, because our orientation is focused on the commander, we set ourselves up to fail at being, I like to say, affective, because that's really what the goal is in modern combat is to create affect over effect. You can go out every day. You can go out and do the same things every day and try to, win because you're being ethical. But the reality is you're not being ethical. You're not in a reliable way repeating any kind of success, and you're not achieving excellence. And that's evidence, because as soon as that unit leaves, I'm like, nothing has changed. Unit after unit comes through. Internally, we think we've done, we did it well. No, I stayed. And I watched everybody make your same mistakes year after year after year. That's why I got good at this thing. So that speed that the military requires, it doesn't work.
I mean, it is a speed. It's also a bias or a focus, understandably, for good historical reasons, on that kinetic activity wins battles and battles win wars. But that's not true. You can win lots of battles and you can lose the war. Yeah. And the reasons that is the case are rooted in ethics, but it's also rooted in culture. And yes, you have the culture card, and yes, you have your core values card. And I used to teach Army ROTC to undergraduates, and I would tell them they were Army, so they had the leadership, acronym, and they could all recite them. And I said, okay, tell me what loyalty means. And they could recite the 1 or 2 sentences. But then we could, beyond, I said, well, why is loyalty important? Or here's a conflict of 2 loyalties between your comrade who just committed a war crime and, say, the Constitution that you've sworn to uphold. These are now in conflict. What are you going to do?
Right.
And that is very difficult, because that, like culture, requires not just thinking about the thing, but thinking about why the thing is the way it is. Why is it the case that certain cultural practices are problematic in certain areas? Like, what's the root of those cultural practices? Where did they come from? And then really importantly, what kind of meaning do they denote, not to you, but to the people who practice them?
Right.
And it's the same thing with ethics. It's not enough to know that, well, I know it, I hear this from people all the time, I know the right thing to do. I'm like, really? I'm an ethicist and I'm confused. Like, I study this for a living, and you know the right thing to do.
Oh my God, yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's this desire for simplicity and clarity. And believe me, like, I am all for clarity, but like, ethics is not a place where you're going to have that. Culture is not a place where you're going to have that. If you don't believe me, look outside your window in this country right now around the issue of race and racial inequity. It's complicated, kids. And it's okay. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Yeah. Just accept. Here's a place to be a good stoic. Accept that it's complex. Don't try to argue with that. Just accept that, and then figure out, given that, how do you need to operate? What do we need to look at in our own military culture and how we wage conflict? I like your term, and I like co-belligerence because, a book on asymmetric warfare. I'm not sure that there was ever a time when you had like simple symmetric warfare. The experience seems to be we're much more aware that there's a variety of ways in which we might interact with our co-belligerents, and not just in kinetic ways. I think it's worth thinking about, if that complexity is a thing, and I think it is, then what does that mean for ethics? Then what does that mean for culture, rather than trying to like cram ethics and culture into some kind of, I will make this simple, I will make it something I can understand and I can deal with and I can control, right? Which that's part of the danger of Stoicism, because Stoicism, at least Epictetus says, to focus on those things in your control and attend to those and to let go those things out of your control. Except as Americans, we're really bad about making that judgment
You don't like that.
about what's in our control and what's not in our control. And we usually over prescribe, oh yes, this is in my control. My children are under my control. Really?
Yeah.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
Like, they might live in your house, but if you really think your children are under your control, like, we should have a conversation over an adult beverage, because I have some news for you, right? So I think it's worth maybe rethinking a lot of our core commitments, which I know is scary and people don't like to do that.
Yeah.
Do you want to be successful in the military? Do we want to be successful as a nation, or are ways of thinking about things that may be a fixed mindset instead of a more broadly open mindset? Is it worth your one, like, I will stick to this view, I don't care what reality says to me? Because reality is a harsh educator.
Yeah.
Like, reality honestly doesn't care what you think. If you think COVID is a hoax, COVID doesn't care.
It doesn't
care.
care.
It's going to kill you.
Mm-mm. War doesn't care. Culture doesn't care. I like to say that culture is omnipresent. It's like gravity. It gets accounted for in everything. Whether you account for it or not, it's getting its share. And one of the things that I've developed in terms of tools is a XY axis. That's a X, but XY axis. And it's just a tool. Like, you can't look directly at culture. It's like staring at the sun to try to see. You can't study it. It doesn't work that way. So you look at your partner and you're looking for outcomes that don't make sense to you. Like, is corruption, passive aggressive behavior, incompetence. If those things come back at you, you have to say, I am not congruent culturally. I don't understand their goals. I don't understand their decision-making process. And if you spend time working on those things to help build trust, you have a chance at getting some things right within that cultural dynamic. By the way, you have to simultaneously make sure they understand your decision-making process and your goals so that you can both be congruent. Otherwise, you're going to appear to them to be, this indomitable force, and they're going to go back to passive aggressive behavior. So is there any does that resonate at all with how we work ethics? Like, is there a way to see outcomes and go, oh my gosh, I'm making ethical mistakes, or I need to shore up what I'm doing?
Well, I guess I would look at it a slightly different way, but I think it's getting after the same thing. I think moral imagination and empathy are really important. Empathy is not feeling sorry for someone. Empathy is being able to enter into someone else's experience, bracketing your own experience, entering into their experience from their point of view as they experience it. And one of my arguments is you cannot be an ethical person unless you can do this.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you only understand, well, this is what is moral from my point of view. And of course, everyone who disagrees with me is completely irrational.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, they are.
And we've been in this, divorce. So you've had these conversations with your significant other, husband, wife, spouse, whatever, brother, sister, right? Of course, they're irrational because they look at it differently than I do. And I think part of being moral is being able to step out of your shoes into someone else's shoes and wander around for a while and let yourself go for a few minutes and try to figure out, what is this like for them, right? So the first Christmas we were in Rhode Island, my oldest son was away from his father for the first time. And I was like, oh, I'm going to make this a great Christmas. I'm going to do this and this and this and this. And he was just a royal snot. And I was like, what is wrong with this child? And I eventually sat down and started thinking about it. I had been thinking about Christmas from my point of view and what I thought he would or should want.
Yep.
I was not thinking about it from his point of view and what he wanted and needed, especially in this moment where it's the first time in his entire life, in 11 years, that he has not spent Christmas with his father and his brother, right? So I think ethics is in that way sort of similar to culture. When you get pushed back, when there's something that seems off, instead of getting defensive, instead of saying, but I'm right and here's all the rational argumentative reasons why I'm right. How about you step back and ask yourself, okay, what is this like from their point of view? What are their assumptions? What are their experiences? What are the things that are leading them to a moral position?
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
What is this like from their point of view? What are their assumptions? What are their experiences? What are the things that are leading them to a moral position, even if I find it reprehensible? Because empathy never involves agreeing with the person. I can empathize with Nazis. That does not mean I agree with them, but I can articulate why they think the way they do, what sort of might have led them to this context, and why they might act that way. And then that does help me check my own views. And sometimes maybe I'm wrong. I don't think I'm wrong in the Nazi case, but I might be wrong in certain kinds of ways. And then you can shift. And especially if you're having to work with someone else, whether that's, in a conflict zone or in your house with the other humans and creatures that live in your house, we're humans and we live in community together. And so part of community is just like with culture, is negotiating what those boundaries are and ultimately why people act the way they do. It's pretty rare that people are completely and utterly irrational. I haven't found very many people that are, or cultures. What I have found is people that I don't agree with their starting premise. And so I don't agree with where they end up, but I can completely see how they got there if you admit that first premise or that experience or whatever it is.
You're describing a lot of what I did, as a spy in a conflict zone. Is my job was to enter their reality. And I had to balance this equation. It's how I always liken it. And I've got to simultaneously enter into the U.S. side of the equation and be relevant enough to explain the other reality and be somewhat believable, and also be allowed to get it wrong, because I'm trying to translate things that don't go together. And one of the teammates I had kind of brought it the liminal space idea, where I'm popping in between these realities and trying to communicate what needs to be communicated between the two elements to nudge them closer, so that as a group they could accept the things that I was seeing as being hey, this is normal, whatever it's going to be. When I talk about rule of law, you're saying rule of law, but so is this guy over here. And you guys are talking about two totally different things. You're the rule of law guy. This is the starting point where they're at right now. If you want to effect your change, you're going to have to accept where they are. And let's not put a judgment on that position where they're at, because let's be honest, what would we be doing if we were to change roles? If I had lived in I'm 50 years old. When has it been peaceful in Afghanistan in the last 50 years? How would I have there's no way I would have a reliable different, I would figure it out. I could be dead, So that's a lot of what I did, was try to enter into these different realms. And still, the biggest problem in this equation was the military all the time. I mean, they struggle with, one of the things I always say to commanders when I first meet them is, even if I'm new to the area, brand new, first day there, and I see the big boss, and they'll say, "Hey, what do you do?" I'm a intelligence operator. I'm going to go out and collect, and I'm going to figure out who the key players are in the valley and make them my friends. He's like, "Oh, great. I want to know who the most influential person is in the valley." And I'm like, "Oh, I've already done that. I already got that figured out." "Oh, how could you do that?" "Well, there's no way you could do it." It's you. Wherever you show up, your money, your power, your guns, everything, it screws everything up. The less powerful you are, the more successful you'll be. You don't believe me, but you'll see. Because I've done this over and over again for all these different commanders. And it drove them a little bit crazy at first, until I learned how to communicate that, which is another part of being in that bubble. And that gives a chance at being somewhat culturally savvy and acute, or have some acuity, I should say. And the same thing with the ethical part. You have a chance at being ethical. If the commander is not going to put any real emphasis on female engagement teams, I've been in a meeting. This is an absolute 100% true thing. And they're like, "Hey, we need to do some female engagement." Okay, great. There's 25 people in the room. And the sergeant major spins around and says, "Well, why don't we get Sergeant Brooks? She's a female. And I'm like, okay, no, stop. That's not good enough, you know?
But that shows, right? My first question, if I've been in the room, would be, why do you want to do female engagement?
Right.
And what does that mean to you? And how does that relate to your mission? I mean, the military is like academia. It is this large, unwieldy bureaucracy that has its sort of its own logic and its own way of functioning. And I think that I don't know that it's the military, so you have that bureaucracy piece, but then you also have human beings that inhabit that bureaucracy. But human beings can stop and say, okay, well, why do we want to do female engagement other than someone higher up the chain of command told us to do that, which is often the reason. But then I think for commanders, you are not engaging in ethical leadership if you cannot articulate to your people why this is ethical. And that I find, since I educate now sort of mid-career military and civilians, that is the hardest thing. People are like, well, no, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I know it's the right thing, or it's in this doctrine, or it's in this, and that's the appeal to authority argument, which makes philosophers kind of witchy. But until you can engage in being able to articulate and justify what is right and what is wrong, you're engaged in moral leadership. You're not engaged in ethical leadership, and people in the military need to be engaged in ethical leadership, especially at the higher levels, but not just at the higher levels. And so what you're describing is very much, we need to do this. We don't know what it is, clearly by the suggestion that was made. Well, it must have something to do with women. So, there's a woman. So she must be good at that. Well, that'll get that sorted. But those kinds of things, by the way, are happening right now in lots of conference rooms with race, and it's the African-American officer in the room instead of the woman, that people are like, hey, he's black. Or she's black. Let's put them on the task force.
Right.
The same problem.
Yeah. And, and I'm using female engagement because, that's what I know. But if I was to go out and survey the female engagement team members, they would all swear they did the right thing. They would have proof of 25 to 50 slides of operations they conducted. But you ask any questions that require any level of sophisticated answer, and they don't have it. Like, they just did it. And so the command doesn't give the emphasis. The training is, look, at best, not good enough. How about that? Just not good enough. And so, you have this perception as an organization that you're somehow gifted at this. And the reality is you're not. Like, you can't go and engage a woman one time and go, we won. I'll come back to the next village tomorrow. Hey, we won. Go to another district in the province. Hey, we won there. And just say, we kept winning everywhere we went. And then I can't go out and find those wins because they don't exist.
But you hear the logic there, though. Like, we had an engagement, and it was successful, so therefore we won. It's the logic of winning battles means winning wars. Right. That's the entire logic that underpins every single thing that happens in the military. And there's deep historical reasons for that logic, especially in the West. I mean, if you read someone like Sun Tzu, he has a very different notion of what counts as winning, and the way to win is not to have to fight in the first place, right? Which from a Western point of view is like, that's really dumb. How do you know you won if you didn't beat them kinetically in battle and, don't have a body count to go? So there's just a way of framing what you're doing, what you think of as success, which people tend not to want to peel the onion back. I hate that phrase, but to peel it back and think about, why is that your frame?
Yeah.
As opposed to other ways of thinking about what success might look like, that it's ongoing engagement over time, which is repeated in different kinds of contexts. I mean, I think it's interesting that someone would think, I went into a village on Tuesday, I had this engagement, it was successful, therefore this village is pacified or has been engaged or whatever it is. Right? That was the kind of logic in Vietnam too.
Right.
Right?
Exactly the same. Yes. So when I go and I look at a unit and I study the unit and I enter their reality, I'm watching their slides. I'm watching their briefing because the commander's being told the radio works. We're putting out messages every day. The radio is the people love hearing music. This is the standard briefing that every electronic warfare officer or PSYOP person delivers when they deliver this briefing. And all I've got to do is ask a couple of questions like, the radius of the thing. How many people show up at the government center requesting songs? How do you know they like music? Well, we did a survey. Can we see the survey? And then you see the survey and it's like, do you like music? Yes, no. You know, you're like, stop. I'm going to get distracted by that stuff. I want to get back to the ethical part of this thing. So someone who wants to build their own, because, you know, look, soldiers, police, all kinds of people are autodidacts and they want to put their hands on the tomes, you know. So obviously Hume and Kant and, you know, look, I can go on and on and on. We've had Dan Robertson on the show, and he's a good modern Stoic writer and everything. But who do we need to have a mastery of to really start to dig into how to do this thing well in these complex situations?
Well, I think there's, from the standpoint of ethics, there's 4 views. One is Kant's sort of rule-based view. Another is utilitarianism. And then something like Aristotle or Hume's virtue ethics, and then care ethics, which originally came out of feminism. And before your listeners turn off right now, broader now. So I would say those 4, but for the military, it's also important to understand the nature of the profession. So the Redefining the Modern Military, which I have a chapter in, is an important book. But then also thinking about civilian-military relations. So last month in Lafayette Square, we had a really good lesson in what's the nature of military-civilian relations that people are still trying to sort out and talk about. So, you know, those are sort of some maybe key places to start. But then it's to you and what you find interesting. If you find Stoicism interesting, great. For God's sake, read something other than Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. That's all I'm asking. And I'm sure your last guest would agree with that. Like, pull out some Seneca.
What? Seneca? What? He just took naps, that guy.
So philosophy is a conversation that evolves over time, and different people are talking to other people. And if you've ever been at a party and you come in the middle of a conversation and you stick your foot in it because you don't know what happened in the conversation before you got there, that's why studying philosophers, especially these older, dead, mostly racist white guys, is still important because of the way the conversation evolved. We might look at Hume and say, yes, his views on persons of color are deeply problematic and racist, and we got to figure out what to do with that. Same thing for Kant and pretty much most parts of the philosophical canon, but we got to figure out what to do with that, right? But there's a conversation here, and our current conversation has been informed. So I'd encourage, people who are listening, who are interested in these things, read the Big Four, read some Civ Mill, read about the profession, and then follow the strands of the conversation that you find interesting, whether that's my book or, my colleagues like Lindsay Cohen and Jim Golby, who do Civ Mill, whether that's the profession discussion, whatever it is, follow the things that you find interesting. Especially, I think sometimes people are scared of philosophy, but there are ways for this to be accessible, and there are people like myself who are happy to sort of, guide you through.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, the link to Pauline's book is in the show right there, and it's called On Obedience: Contrasting Philosophies for the Military, Citizenry, and Community. Since we're talking about the citizenry and community in your book, what do we do about the police problem in general? I'm going to frame this a little bit. It's always a tragedy when the police kill someone through use of force, even if it was a necessity. But I think the bigger problem is the us versus them attitude that police have, like the default to arrest somebody and we'll let the judge sort it out. If you didn't do anything and someone rips your freedom away from you, and then you have to go to jail, get bailed out, be embarrassed, missed work, go through court, go through the stress of the court case to have the DA go, forget it. Well, it's horrible. It's a horrible trust destroying endeavor, and that's just someone who didn't do anything. Now imagine, all the other scenarios that go up from that in terms of complexity. How do we look, and the police are willing, they want to know, like, how do we do this better, and from an advanced academic level, not just like defund. Let's not be that silly. Let's get smart about this. How do police departments, and then on the backside, how does society act more ethically, would you say, as a professor?
So this is complicated. It's further complicated by the fact both my children are minority young men, minority teenagers. One's African American, one's Latino. So the last few months has sort of, been a different, maybe I have a different take than most academics do because of my personal commitments. What I would say is, like with warfare, we need to think about how do we view policing. I taught philosophy of law for a long time, and there's lots of theories of punishment and theories of state violence and theories about what the police are for. And how did our current models of policing evolve? How did we evolve to have essentially this sort of warrior, us-them mindset? And there may be some good historical reasons why that evolved. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that we still have to be committed. I mean, people have done really good research on how the current policing models are rooted in, slave patrols. Okay, that's not a good model, right?
Let's start there.
We would hope that let's start there. Let's start with the things that we do think are important. But then I think, the police officers that I talk to, a lot of them are like, listen, I'm not a social worker. I don't have mental health training. There's most of the calls that I get are having to negotiate like the bounds of human community, like the husband and wife who are fighting, the neighbor who's terrified of anyone who's not white walking around her neighborhood, maybe for good reasons, maybe not. So there's sort of a broader discussion about what is policing for. Let's do that. Let's do that well. Let's train people in de-escalation. Let's rethink the use of force continuum. Let's do all of those things. But then let's also not have cops doing things they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah. They're
not trained to do and don't want to do. Like we farmed out it's sort of like the military. We don't know what to do when something happens overseas.
Yes.
Like Iran is misbehaving. We don't know what to do. We're like, send in special forces, send in the Marines. We don't know. It's like our easy button.
Yes.
Well, in domestic society, cops are our easy button. When we don't know what else to do, well, you call the cops. Well, that's intellectual and social laziness, right? There are other ways that we could learn as a society to cope with, to deal with a lot of the things that the police get called for that they really are not helpful for, not trained for, and it's not part of their profession, right? So if there's a benefit to the defund movement, it's to open up the conversation of what's appropriate in policing, what's ethical in policing, what's not. The other piece is I would like to recall, as many of my friends and former students who are police, recall them to the notion of what their profession is. And part of that is ethical norms and standards, but it is also service to the community, for protect and serve. And so anything that does not fall into that and any action that's being taken that doesn't conform to that norm, I think is deeply problematic. But I think we've gotten to a point in society, the reason why police are so powerful is because we've handed them, they're our easy button. We don't know what else to do with this stuff. And so rather than engage with race and poverty and the breakdown of the family and difficult interpersonal relations and drug use and schools and homelessness, rather than deal with those issues, we're like, we'll let the cops handle. We'll put the cops in the schools.
Yeah.
There's a good idea. So some of it is, as I've argued in the book, it's not just the military civilian where the military needs to do stuff. The civilian side needs to do stuff. We as civilians, I don't like that language when it comes to the police, but we as citizens have to start taking more responsibility and stop calling the cops every time there's a person you don't recognize in your neighborhood. For example, I just moved to a new neighborhood. I'm scared to death that my son will go for a walk outside and someone will call the cops on him because they don't recognize him. So we just moved to the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right. So some of this is about changing how we think about things. Some of it is about police sort of, coming back to their own sense of profession. And there are cops who are really like on Twitter, Patrick Skinner, like I love his feed. He is committed to the work and doing it the right way. And there are people like that. And those are the people that I want on the street.
Yeah.
They are the people that I want to be there. And we need more of those kind of people and less sort of the warrior, vet bro, us versus them, and I'm taking out the bad guys. Like it's a bad Steven Seagal action movie. That is not
I want to include some of the other bad actors in this too, the executive branch side of things. You know, the mayors who aren't able to guide their expert cop. You know, we just had a guy who's got 40 plus years in LA County sheriffs and that complex job working that giant, district. The executive branch has to do their job in terms of provisioning all this extra training, dealing with mental health. And, because we dump that on the cops too. Like, hey, we're not sure what to do with mental health. So how about we'll let them all go and then you cops can deal with that in addition to get my cat out of the tree. I just saw 2 cops from Pembroke Pines in Miami area swim across an estuary, where there's always alligators, to go save someone, and then the next call is going to be like, it's an impossible situation. And if we're going to have good police and get rid of the bad apples, it's going to be expensive. Train to reward that kind, because those people will get hired away by Microsoft or Apple or something. They're like, it's just too hard. And then the other part is when I talk to folks about this in society, we struggle to know what our role is in this. Like, how do we all personally take accountability for what we're going to do? I know, like for me, as a combat guy, when I see a police officer and I'm engaged with them, I do everything I can in my power to let them know that I'm not a threat. I'm going to put my hands on the wheel. I'm going to move very slowly. I'll go so far as to interlock my fingers, my index and my thumb. So I say, look, I'm going to stay like this until you get, because if they got their hand by their gun, I'm like, we got to slow down. Because I can see where your hands are, you can see where my hands are, and yours are in a dangerous spot for me, but I take that, I act like someone who doesn't want to get shot. Now it's easy as a 50-year-old dude to say. When you're 18, your brain doesn't work like that. So, but we do owe ourselves, a better police department. It costs more money, but we also have to act in a way that is less conducive to escalation on both sides,
Yeah. And I think, if you have more cops who have a different mindset, who are trained in a certain way, because what looks escalatory to one person may not look that way to another person, depending on their experience, right? So I think, if you could have a lot of these other things like mental health in schools and homelessness dealt with not through police department, then the police would have time for, this training and these other things. But it's also going to be a matter of, you have some people who have that warrior bad action movie mindset. And there's a reason domestic violence rates are so high among police officers as well as in the military, right? There's certain sort of cultural things
we
tied to
self-select
culture,
into that. Yeah.
masculinity. There's all kinds of things there that have to be dealt with as well. And we haven't dealt with it. And now we're sort of, I'm hoping, at a point of national reckoning where we can say, okay, this is something that we need to rethink. Because my 13-year-old and 15-year-old have both had multiple iterations of the conversation about exactly what to do when they engage with police, because I need them home alive. Right. And there's the conversation that you have. But, as a mother, when they're late coming home, I'm not thinking they're out drinking. I'm thinking I'm going to get called to ID their body in the morgue. That's where my brain goes.
Every siren, it's The mom dilemma is hard. Well, listen, I've had you for an hour and it's been fantastic. Do you want to ask me a question before we wrap up? I've been hammering away on you for an hour.
So before we wrap up, what do you think is the thing that ethicists don't understand? So people like me, what is the thing about the military that you think we don't understand or take as seriously as we should? So what don't I know?
I don't know that this applies to you in general. My experience with people who are ethicists, and sometimes, they're more moralists or, moralists, I guess you'd say, they don't understand how quickly and how complex the ethical landscape changes. It's spherical. It does not make sense. We're constantly dealing with what I call miscomfort, because it's not discomfort. It's just, once you learn to deal with it, you can adapt to it. But that complexity, that change, it's hard for folks in the academic world to understand that, because you just don't have you don't have the ground experience to deal with what I've seen us deal with. And it makes it challenging because the solutions that come down, the training we get, the education we get, it's not useful. It's not useful at all, And so that's the big challenge. And again, I'm talking to you about it. I don't think that's true for you. I think you and I are talking about very similar things and approaches to these things, but understanding just how hard it can be day to day to constantly, iterate through all these different things and then get in a firefight and have it be 115 degrees and you haven't had a really good meal in weeks, and it's very hard to expect a unit of men primarily to go out and act in a way that you would think was ethical. And I don't want to get into a whole long conversation, but like these really hard charcoal gray areas like Clint Lawrence, they're terrible decisions that shouldn't happen, but war does that. I've been in the conference room when the commander is trying to decide between prosecute or forgive someone who followed the rules of engagement but killed an innocent person and watch that person's career in the balance. And it's terrifying when you realize, that person was terrified that they were going to die and did what they were trained to do. And the commander ultimately sided with that person, but it didn't go that way with Clint. And I don't know what the right answer is for Clint. I wasn't there. There's all kinds of problems with that whole story, or someone like Bo Bergdahl. I don't know what to do about that. It's hard. And it's not black and white. And when we look at these problems and we pass judgment, I can just say that you could be on another patrol, have the exact same thing happen, have a totally different outcome. And, it doesn't exist because we don't even know about it,
Yeah, I think that's helpful. It's always good for ethicists to remember that, we think we know stuff. I mean, I always try, and that's part of why I have a pretty active Twitter feed, because I expect people like you to keep me honest. And, both of my books were vetted that way. I said, here's what I'm thinking about, y'all. Tell me what's wrong with it. And people did, but that's really helpful because I don't have I don't have the same experiential knowledge that you all have. So this dialogue, I'm really grateful to have been on the show and to have this dialogue because I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, well, anytime I can help out, I'm glad to do it. And I don't profess to know everything. I just know the things that I've seen us do as a military and State Department. Boy, they're a bunch of assholes too. So we get us all in a room, and we're glad to make a bunch of mistakes. Either way, everybody should get out and go buy her book if you're into the whole ethics thing. If you're in the military or police, you really need to read this. On Obedience: Contrasting Philosophies for the Military, Citizenry, and Community. Available on Amazon. If you use the link, we'll get a little kickback from that. And just, Pauline, let's do more of these conversations. Let's find some more people to challenge ourselves and get uncomfortable so we can try to sort through some of these complex things so that maybe we can find some easier things to train and educate people on.
Absolutely. Thank you.